A man lies dying in a borrowed room, clutching manuscripts he's spent decades writing. Outside, the English Civil War rages. Inside, Thomas Hobbes, philosopher, mathematician, political theorist, faces the consequences of ideas so dangerous they've made him a fugitive in his own country. He's 91 years old, and the question that haunted his entire life remains unanswered. Can human beings ever truly escape the chaos they create? This is the story of how a frightened child became the philosopher who convinced the world that without absolute power, civilization itself would collapse into barbarism. It's a journey from Tudor England to the birth of modern political thought, from poverty to influence, from safety to exile and back again. And it begins not with philosophy, but with terror. April 5th, 1588. The Spanish Armada is sailing toward England's shores, carrying soldiers to overthrow Queen Elizabeth and restore Catholic rule. In the small town of Westport, near Malmesbury in Wiltshire, a woman goes into labour prematurely, her body responding to the panic gripping the nation. The child born that day will later write that his mother gave birth to twins, himself and fear. Thomas Hobbes never forgot that his first breath was drawn in an atmosphere of existential dread. The Armada loomed over his birth like a prophecy, a reminder that violence and chaos were never far from even the quietest English town. This fear, not the abstract philosophical kind, but the visceral, gut-level terror of imminent destruction, would become the foundation of everything he thought about human nature and political order. His father was also named Thomas Hobbes, but there the similarities ended. The elder Thomas was the vicar of Charlton and Westport, a position that should have provided modest security. Instead, he was a disaster. An ignorant man who could barely read Latin, he was better known for brawling than preaching. When young Thomas was still a child, his father got into a physical fight at the door of his own church, struck another clergyman, and was forced to flee the area in disgrace. He vanished from his family's life completely, abandoning his wife and children to whatever fate awaited them. What saved young Thomas from a destitution was his uncle, Francis Hobbes, a prosperous glover who recognised something unusual in the boy. While his older brother Edmund seemed destined for the family trade, Thomas showed an almost unnatural aptitude for learning. He absorbed languages the way other children absorbed games. By age 6, he was already studying Latin and Greek. His uncle, childless and wealthy enough to afford generosity, decided to invest in the boy's education. At 8, Thomas was sent to a small private school in Westport, run by a man named Robert Latimer. This wasn't the brutal rote memorization factory that passed for education in many places. Latimer was a scholar who'd studied at Oxford, a man who understood that learning could be more than mechanical repetition. Under his guidance, Hobbes didn't just memorize Latin conjugations, he fell in love with the classical world. The ancient texts opened like doors into a different universe. Here were societies that had grappled with the same fundamental questions that troubled the young Hobbes. How should people live together? What makes a government legitimate? When is violence justified? The Romans and Greeks hadn't solved these problems, but they'd at least asked them with a clarity that seemed absent from the fractured, violent England of Hobbes's childhood. By 14, Hobbes could translate Greek and Latin with fluency that impressed even Oxford scholars. He'd read Virgil, studied Aristotle, and developed a hunger for knowledge that his small-town education could no longer satisfy. His uncle recognised this and made a decision that would change everything. He would send Thomas to Oxford. In 1603, at 15 years old, Hobbes arrived at Magdalen Hall, Oxford. He expected to find the greatest minds in England engaged in profound debates about the nature of reality and human society. What he found instead was a medieval institution slowly rotting from within, clinging to methods and ideas that seemed increasingly disconnected from the world outside its walls. Oxford in the early 17th century was still dominated by scholasticism, the philosophical tradition that had ruled European universities for centuries. The curriculum was built around Aristotle, interpreted through layers of medieval commentary. Students learned logic through formal syllogisms, studied metaphysics through abstract categories, and debated questions that seemed designed to have no practical application whatsoever. Can angels move instantaneously? How many substances exist in the Eucharist? What is the precise nature of universal forms? Hobbes hated almost every minute of it. He found the scholastic method sterile and pointless, an elaborate game played by men who seemed more interested in verbal cleverness than in understanding the actual world. The professors droned through their lectures, reciting interpretations of Aristotle, never asking whether any of it corresponded to reality. Students were expected to memorize, recite, and defend positions they hadn't chosen and often didn't understand. But Oxford wasn't entirely wasted on Hobbes. While he despised the official curriculum, he discovered something else in the university's libraries and informal gatherings, the new learning that was beginning to seep into England from continental Europe. Men were starting to question Aristotle, to perform experiments, to measure and observe rather than simply deduce from first principles. The old certainties were cracking, and through those cracks light was beginning to show. Hobbes didn't distinguish himself academically at Oxford. He did enough to get by, but his heart wasn't in the formal exercises. Instead, he read voraciously in areas the university didn't emphasize: geography, astronomy, the new reports coming back from explorers who were mapping a world far larger and stranger than Aristotle had imagined. He was teaching himself to think outside the narrow channels the university tried to impose. In 1608, Hobbes completed his Bachelor of Arts degree. He was 20 years old, equipped with a classical education he half despised, and a growing conviction that the way educated men approached knowledge was fundamentally broken. But he had no money, no prospects, and no clear path forward. What he needed was a patron, someone willing to pay for the peculiar services of a young man whose main skill was reading books and having opinions about them. The position that changed Hobbes's life came through Oxford connections. The Cavendish family, one of the wealthiest and most influential noble houses in England, needed a tutor for their son. William Cavendish, just slightly younger than Hobbes himself, was about to embark on the grand tour of Europe that was customary for young aristocrats. He needed a companion, someone educated enough to be a guide, but deferential enough to remember his place. Hobbes accepted immediately. It was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, without quite knowing it. As tutor and companion to William Cavendish, he would gain access to a world that would have been forever closed to the son of a disgraced vicar. He would meet the most influential thinkers in Europe, correspond with natural philosophers and mathematicians, and gradually build a reputation that had nothing to do with his family's name or fortune. But first he had to survive being a servant to a young man who possessed all the privileges Hobbes lacked. The relationship between Hobbes and William Cavendish is difficult to reconstruct precisely, but certain facts are clear. They were roughly the same age, yet separated by an unbridgeable gulf of social class. William would one day become the Earl of Devonshire, controlling vast estates and wielding real political power. Hobbes was an employee, paid to smooth William's path through classical learning and continental culture. Yet something more complex than simple service emerged. William seems to have genuinely liked Hobbes, respected his intelligence, and treated him less like a servant and more like a companion. Hobbes, for his part, maintained the careful balance required of his position, knowledgeable enough to be useful, deferential enough to be safe. He was learning a skill that would serve him throughout his life, how to navigate courts and noble houses without ever quite belonging to them. In 1610, they set off for France and Italy. For Hobbes, it was revelation. Paris burst with intellectual energy that made Oxford look like a provincial backwater. Italian cities combined Renaissance splendor with the kind of political intrigue that would later fascinate him. He saw how power actually operated, unencumbered by the polite fictions that obscured it in England. He met scholars who were beginning to approach knowledge in radically new ways. This first continental journey lasted until 1615. When Hobbes returned to England, he was a different person than the Oxford graduate who'd left 5 years earlier. He'd seen enough of the world to understand how little he actually knew. The classical learning he'd acquired seemed increasingly inadequate for understanding the forces that actually shaped human society. Something new was needed, some way of thinking about politics and human nature that didn't rely on ancient authorities or theological assumptions. But he wasn't ready yet to develop that new way of thinking. First, he needed to understand mathematics, and that understanding would come from the most unlikely source, a chance encounter with a geometry book lying open on a table. The Earl of Devonshire, William Cavendish's father, died in 1626. William inherited the title and vast estates, but he didn't forget the tutor who'd accompanied him through Europe. Hobbes remained in the Cavendish household, though his role had shifted. He was now less a tutor and more a secretary, intellectual companion, and trusted member of a household that gave him financial security and social connections far beyond what his birth would normally allow. It was during this period, now in his late 30s, that Hobbes discovered geometry. The story he later told was almost comically simple. He was in a gentleman's library when he happened to see Euclid's Elements lying open to a particular proposition. He read it, found it absurd, and traced it back through the chain of proofs to the axioms. By the time he finished, he was convinced, not despite the strangeness of the method, but because of it. Here was knowledge built from the ground up, each step following logically from the previous one. Nothing assumed without proof. No appeals to authority, no reliance on ancient texts, just pure logical necessity, unfolding like a flower from a handful of self-evident truths. It was everything scholastic philosophy wasn't. Where Aristotelian logic spun elaborate verbal webs that caught nothing, geometry built structures that actually stood. Hobbes became obsessed. At an age when most men's intellectual habits are set, he taught himself advanced mathematics with the single-minded intensity of a convert. He worked through Euclid, then moved on to the new analytical geometry being developed on the continent. He corresponded with mathematicians, attempted his own proofs, and began to imagine what might be possible if you could apply this geometrical method to subjects beyond mathematics. What if you could create a science of politics as rigorous as geometry? What if human behaviour, which seems so chaotic and unpredictable, actually followed laws as precise as those governing triangles? The idea began to take shape in his mind, still vague but compelling. Everything he'd observed, the violence of his childhood, the political instability he'd witnessed, the way societies seemed to teeter constantly on the edge of chaos, might be explicable through a systematic study of human nature. But he wasn't ready to write that system yet. First, he needed to understand more about the new natural philosophy that was emerging across Europe. In 1629, another opportunity for continental travel arose, and Hobbes seized it. This second journey to Europe, from 1629 to 1631, brought Hobbes into contact with the intellectual revolution that was remaking European thought. In Paris, he encountered the circle around Marin Mersenne, a Franciscan friar who had made himself the hub of mathematical and scientific correspondence across Europe. Through Mersenne's network, ideas flowed freely between thinkers who might never meet in person. It was an early version of the scientific community, bound together by letters and shared curiosity rather than institutional structures. Hobbes also spent time in Florence, where an aging Galileo was under house arrest for advocating the Copernican system. Though they may never have met directly, Galileo's work made a profound impression on Hobbes. Here was a man who'd pointed a telescope at the heavens and seen things that contradicted everything Aristotle had taught. And rather than defer to ancient authority, Galileo had trusted observation and mathematical reasoning. The result was a new astronomy, a new physics, a new way of understanding the cosmos. If Galileo could overturn 2,000 years of astronomical consensus through careful observation and mathematical analysis, what else might be possible? What other ancient certainties were waiting to be demolished by someone brave enough to question them? Hobbes returned to England in 1631, with his mind full of new ideas and new methods. He was 43 years old, and he'd spent decades absorbing knowledge without producing much of his own. That was about to change, but the transformation wouldn't come from philosophy initially. It would come from an entirely unexpected direction, a decision to translate an ancient Greek historian who'd written about the collapse of democracy into chaos and civil war. Thucydides had watched his own civilization tear itself apart. He'd been there in Athens during the Peloponnesian War, commanding troops, witnessing the collapse of rational politics into tribal rage. He'd documented with clinical precision how democracy could curdle into mob rule, how rhetoric could poison judgment, how quickly civilized men could descend into atrocity. 500 years after Plato, Thucydides understood something that most political thinkers still missed. Peace wasn't natural. Order required work. In 1628, Hobbes published his translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. On the surface, it was simply an English version of an ancient Greek text. But for Hobbes, it was something more. A warning, a case study, a demonstration of what happens when political authority breaks down. The timing mattered. England in the late 1620s was sliding toward crisis. King Charles I was locked in conflict with Parliament, over money, over religion, over the fundamental question of where ultimate authority resided. The arguments were getting sharper, the rhetoric more heated. People who understood history could see where this was heading. Hobbes's translation emphasized certain passages, the speech of the Athenian general Pericles praising democratic deliberation, but also the Melian dialogue, where Athenian envoys explained to a weaker city that justice only exists between equals, that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Thucydides had no illusions about power, neither did Hobbes. But translation wasn't enough. Hobbes had spent his life observing, reading, thinking. Now, as he approached 50, he began to feel the pressure to produce something original. The mathematical method he'd discovered in Euclid, the mechanical philosophy he'd encountered in Paris, the political chaos he saw developing around him, all of it needed to come together into a system. The breakthrough came through optics. It sounds bizarre. How do you get from the study of light to a theory of political power? But for Hobbes, the connection was obvious. Vision worked through motion. When you saw something, it was because tiny particles were bouncing off objects and striking your eye, setting up a chain of mechanical causes that eventually produced the sensation of seeing. Nothing mystical, no forms or essences or spiritual qualities, just matter in motion. And if vision worked that way, what about thought itself? Hobbes began developing a radically materialist philosophy of mind. Thinking, he argued, was just a kind of internal motion, calculations performed by the machinery of the brain. Memory was stored motion. Imagination was decaying sense impressions. Even emotions could be reduced to mechanical principles. Desire was motion towards something. Aversion was motion away. It was brutally reductive. It eliminated everything philosophers had traditionally said about the soul, about free will, about the special status of human consciousness. We weren't angels temporarily inhabiting meat. We were just the meat, complex machines that happened to be self-aware. The implications were staggering. If humans were just sophisticated mechanisms, then human behavior should be predictable. You could develop a science of human nature, the same way you could develop a science of falling bodies. And if you understood human nature scientifically, you could design political systems that actually worked instead of relying on tradition, custom, or divine right. Hobbes began writing. His first major philosophical work, Elements of Law, Natural and Politic, circulated in manuscript in 1640. It wasn't published immediately. Hobbes was cautious about putting his name to controversial ideas, but it showed where his thinking had arrived. The argument started with psychology. Humans, Hobbes claimed, were driven by two fundamental passions, desire and fear. We wanted things, power, security, pleasure, status. And we feared things, pain, death, humiliation, loss. Everything else was just variations on these basic themes. In the natural state, before any government existed, these passions would produce chaos. You want something, I want the same thing, and there's no authority to decide between us. So we fight. Maybe you win today, but you have to sleep eventually, and I might come back stronger. Nobody's ever truly secure. Life becomes a war of all against all, where the only law is survival, and the only morality is winning. Hobbes had a phrase for this state, the condition of mere nature. Later, he'd call it something more memorable. But the concept was already there in 1640. Human beings without government were human beings in hell. The solution was to create an artificial person, a commonwealth, by transferring everyone's individual power to a single sovereign authority. Not through conquest, but through agreement. People would recognize that the chaos of the natural state was intolerable and voluntarily submit to a power strong enough to keep them all in check. This sovereign, whether a king, an assembly, or some other form, would hold absolute authority, not because of divine right or ancient tradition, but because absolute authority was the only thing that could prevent society from collapsing back into the war of all against all. Half measures wouldn't work. Limited government wouldn't work. You needed a Leviathan, a mortal god, strong enough to keep everyone afraid of breaking the peace. It was a stunning argument, completely unlike anything in the existing political theory. Hobbes wasn't justifying monarchy through appeals to God or natural hierarchy. He was justifying absolute power through a rational calculation of self-interest. And he was doing it just as England was about to explode. In November 1640, the Long Parliament convened. Charles I had been ruling without Parliament for 11 years, funding his government through increasingly creative and unpopular taxes. Now he needed money desperately. Scotland had risen in rebellion, and the king needed an army. So he had no choice but to call Parliament back. They didn't give him what he wanted. Instead, they began systematically dismantling the mechanisms of royal power, arresting the king's ministers, abolishing the hated courts, passing laws that would prevent Charles from dismissing them again. The king tried to fight back. In January 1642, he personally led troops into the House of Commons to arrest 5 members for treason. They escaped. The king fled London. By August, both sides were raising armies. The civil war had begun. Hobbes saw it coming. The elements of law had been prescient. Here was exactly the breakdown of authority he'd predicted. But prescience didn't make him safe. The manuscript had circulated among royalist intellectuals, and some of his arguments were being cited by the king's supporters. If Parliament won, Hobbes could be in danger, and Parliament was winning. In late 1640, before the shooting started, Hobbes made a decision that would define the next 11 years of his life. He fled to France. He wasn't the only English intellectual seeking refuge on the continent. Paris was filling up with royalist exiles, men who'd supported Charles and now found England too dangerous. They clustered in certain neighbourhoods, frequented certain coffee houses, and spent their time plotting the king's restoration while trying not to starve. Hobbes joined them, but he wasn't particularly interested in plots. He had a book to write. The years in Paris were difficult but productive. Hobbes was in his 50s now. Not a young man, and exile was hard. He tutored the young Prince of Wales, the future Charles II, in mathematics to make money. He attended Merzen's gatherings and argued with other philosophers about motion, matter, and the nature of reality. And he wrote. The first product was Deceive, On the Citizen, published in 1642. It was a Latin version of the political theory he'd sketched in Elements of Law, refined and expanded. The argument was tighter now, the logic more rigorous, and Hobbes was bolder about his conclusions. Without government, he wrote, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That phrase would become perhaps the most famous thing he ever wrote, a 5-word summary of the human condition in the state of nature. It wasn't meant to be depressing, it was meant to be realistic, and it made the case for absolute sovereignty even stronger. Anything was better than that. Exile made Hobbes famous among European intellectuals. Here was an Englishman who'd actually lived through the collapse of political order, who'd seen his predictions come true, and who'd developed a systematic theory to explain it all. The book was controversial, certainly. Hobbes's materialism offended religious thinkers. His absolutism offended Republicans. His entire method offended people who thought philosophy should deal with timeless truths rather than messy political realities. But nobody could ignore him. And Hobbes wasn't done. While writing political philosophy, he'd also been developing a complete philosophical system. He conceived of it in 3 parts: body, man, and citizen. The first would establish the principles of matter and motion. The second would apply those principles to human beings specifically. The third would extend the analysis to politics. He'd started with the third part, Deceive, because the political situation was urgent. But now he wanted to go back and complete the system. De corpore, on body, would establish the foundations. Everything was matter in motion. Everything could be explained through mechanical causes. There was no need for Aristotelian forms, no need for occult qualities, no need for anything except particles pushing against each other according to mathematical laws. It was the same vision that Galileo and Descartes were developing, but Hobbes pushed it further. Descartes had exempted the human mind from his mechanism, arguing that thought was fundamentally different from matter. Hobbes refused to make that exception. Mind was matter too. Consciousness was just a particular arrangement of moving parts. The implications for religion were explosive. If everything was mechanical, including human thought, then what happened to the soul? What happened to free will? What happened to God? Hobbes was careful here. He claimed to be a Christian, attended church, and insisted that his philosophy was compatible with true religion. But his God was increasingly abstract, increasingly distant from the personal deity of traditional Christianity. And his religion was increasingly focused on obedience to political authority rather than private devotion. Critics accused him of atheism, disguised by tactical deference. They weren't entirely wrong. Hobbes believed in God the way you might believe in a first cause, a logical necessity required to explain why anything exists. But the God of miracles, of answered prayers, of personal salvation, that God was harder to find in Hobbes's system. Meanwhile, the war in England was going badly for the Royalists. By 1646, Charles was defeated. He surrendered to the Scottish army, who promptly sold him to Parliament. For 2 years, various factions tried to negotiate some kind of settlement. Could the king be restored with limited powers? Could Parliament rule without him? Could the army, which was developing its own radical political ideas, be brought under control? The answer to all these questions turned out to be no. In January 1649, Charles was tried for treason and executed. England became a republic, and Hobbes's argument that absolute sovereignty was necessary to prevent chaos seemed to have been refuted by events. Here was Parliament exercising supreme power without a king, and the country hadn't collapsed. Hobbes wasn't convinced. The execution of the king had been an act of sovereign power, proof that ultimate authority resided somewhere, even if it wasn't in a single person, and the republic's stability remained to be seen. Civil wars had a way of coming back. He kept writing. The great work was taking shape now, the complete statement of his political philosophy that would incorporate everything he'd learned over a lifetime of observation and thought. It would be called Leviathan, named for the biblical sea monster, the creature so powerful that no earthly force could resist it. The manuscript grew through 1650. Hobbes was 62 years old, an exile in Paris, living on uncertain patronage and the money he made tutoring. His eyesight was failing, his health was fragile, but his mind was sharp, and he was determined to complete the work that would define his legacy. In 1651, Leviathan was published in London. It was massive, over 500 pages, divided into 4 parts. The first established the materialist psychology. The second developed the political theory. The third dealt with irreligion. The fourth attacked what Hobbes called the kingdom of darkness. All the false beliefs and corrupt institutions that prevented people from seeing the truth. It was the most comprehensive, most systematic, most ruthlessly logical defense of absolute sovereignty ever written. And it was about to make Hobbes one of the most hated men in Europe. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Leviathan landed in England like a bomb. Royalists hated it because Hobbes suggested that any government with effective power deserved obedience, which meant the new Commonwealth had as much claim to loyalty as the dead king. Parliamentarians hated it because Hobbes argued for absolute power concentrated in a single sovereign, which undermined their entire constitutional project. Religious authorities on all sides hated it because Hobbes had subordinated church to state and stripped religion of its supernatural claims. The book's very appearance was dangerous. That frontispiece everyone remembers, the giant crowned figure rising above a landscape, its body composed of hundreds of tiny human beings. That was visual theology rendered in political terms. The sovereign was literally made of its subjects, their power transferred upward to create something greater than any individual. But look closer at that image. The giant holds a sword in one hand and a bishop's crozier in the other. Temporal and spiritual authority united. No separation between church and state. No higher power to which the sovereign must answer. This was heresy to almost everyone. Catholics believed the Pope held authority above kings. Protestants believed Scripture held authority above governments. Even moderate Anglicans believed the Church retained some independence from political control. Hobbes believed none of this. The sovereign was absolute, or it was nothing. Divide authority, and you invite civil war. The personal attack started immediately. Hobbes was called an atheist, a heretic, a corrupter of youth, a monster. His former pupil, the young Charles II, now in exile, began to distance himself. The royalist court in Paris, where Hobbes had sought refuge, grew cold. Courtiers who'd previously welcomed the famous philosopher now avoided him. He'd become toxic, a liability to anyone seeking favour. Worse, the English Catholics in Paris were particularly hostile. They'd never trusted Hobbes's materialism, and now they had ammunition. In his chapter on the Kingdom of Darkness, Hobbes had savaged the Catholic Church specifically, calling it a ghost of the deceased Roman Empire, sitting crowned upon the grave thereof. This wasn't subtle criticism, this was warfare. The Catholic clergy complained to French authorities. Hobbes's position became precarious. Here was a man who'd fled England to escape civil war, now facing potential expulsion from France for religious reasons. At 63, he had nowhere safe to go. But then something unexpected happened. In 1652, Hobbes decided to return to England. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. The royalist court no longer wanted him. The French were threatening action, and England, despite everything, was at least English. He made peace with the Commonwealth government, swearing an oath of loyalty to the new regime. This infuriated the royalists, who viewed it as betrayal, but Hobbes was merely being consistent with his own philosophy. The Commonwealth held effective power. It maintained order. It prevented civil war from resuming. By Hobbes's own logic, it deserved obedience. Back in England, he settled in London and kept writing. The controversy over Leviathan continued to build. Universities banned the book. The clergy preached against it. Philosophers lined up to refute it. And Hobbes fought back, entering into public disputes with anyone willing to engage. His most significant battle was with John Bramhall, the Bishop of Derry. They debated free will years earlier in Paris, but now Bramhall published his side of that old conversation without permission, attacking Hobbes's determinism. Hobbes responded with his own publication. The two men traded increasingly bitter pamphlets through the 1650s. Bramhall argued that Hobbes's philosophy destroyed moral responsibility. If everything is determined by mechanical causes, how can anyone be blamed for their actions? How can virtue and vice exist? How can God justly punish sin? Hobbes's answer was characteristically blunt. Actions are determined, yes, but punishment still works because it's part of the causal chain that determines future actions. You punish crime not because criminals freely chose evil, but because punishment creates fear, and fear prevents future crime. Morality isn't about some mystical free will. It's about maintaining social order through incentives. This satisfied almost no one. But Hobbes didn't care about satisfying people. He cared about logical consistency. Throughout the 1650s, he continued developing his system. He'd already published his political philosophy and psychology. Now he turned back to physics, publishing De Corpore in 1655. This was his attempt to work out a complete mechanical account of nature, from basic motion through complex phenomena. It included a section on geometry, and this proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Hobbes claimed to have solved one of mathematics' ancient problems, squaring the circle. The challenge was to construct a square with the same area as a given circle, using only compass and straight edge. Mathematicians had been attempting this for 2,000 years. Hobbes announced he'd succeeded. He hadn't. His proof was wrong, obviously wrong to anyone with mathematical training. John Wallis, professor of geometry at Oxford, tore it apart in print. And unlike philosophical debates where both sides could claim victory, this was mathematics. There was a right answer and a wrong answer. Hobbes was demonstrably wrong. He refused to admit it. For the next 25 years, Hobbes would publish defense after defense of his mathematical claims, each one more desperate than the last. Wallis responded with increasing exasperation, eventually mocking the old philosopher's stubbornness. The quarrel became personal, vicious, embarrassing. Hobbes's reputation as a thinker took serious damage. If he couldn't recognize an error in geometry, could his philosophical arguments be trusted? But here's what's strange. The mathematical controversy didn't diminish Leviathan's influence. The book continued spreading through underground channels, passed hand to hand among young intellectuals, students, anyone curious about radical ideas. It was dangerous to own openly, but people read it anyway. The arguments were too powerful to ignore. Why do we obey authority? What makes government legitimate? Can religious claims override political necessity? These weren't abstract questions in 1650s England. They were matters of life and death, and Hobbes had provided answers that cut through centuries of confused thinking, even if those answers were unpalatable. Then in 1660, everything changed again. The Commonwealth collapsed. The military government that had replaced it proved unstable. And English society, exhausted by 2 decades of upheaval, invited Charles II back from exile. The restoration was complete. The monarchy was restored. And Thomas Hobbes had a problem. He'd sworn loyalty to the Commonwealth. He'd justified their rule in philosophical terms. He'd made peace with the regicides, Now the royalists were back in power, and they remembered. Charles II remembered too, but here's where Hobbes's argument about sovereignty saved him. He'd never argued for the Commonwealth specifically. He'd argued that whoever holds effective power deserves obedience. When the king held power, obey the king. When Parliament held power, obey Parliament. When the king returned to power, obey the king again. It was perfectly consistent. The king, who'd known Hobbes since childhood, understood this, or perhaps he simply didn't want to punish an old man who'd once been his tutor. Either way, Hobbes was granted a royal pension and allowed to live in peace. For a while, the Restoration brought back the Anglican Church with renewed authority, and the Church had not forgotten Leviathan. In 1666, London burned. The Great Fire destroyed much of the city, and people looked for explanations. Some blamed God's judgment on English sin, others blamed Catholics, and some blamed dangerous ideas that had corrupted the nation's morals. A bill was introduced in Parliament to investigate atheism and to identify books that promoted irreligion. Leviathan was mentioned specifically. Hobbes was 78 years old. The prospect of being officially condemned for heresy was terrifying. He could be imprisoned, his books burned, his pension revoked. He might even be executed. The bill didn't pass, but it came close enough to frighten him. He stopped publishing controversial material. He became more cautious, more circumspect. The old fighter grew careful. Yet even in his final decades, Hobbes couldn't stop thinking, couldn't stop writing. If he couldn't publish philosophy or politics, he'd do something else. So he translated Homer. At 86, Thomas Hobbes completed English translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Critics pointed out that he didn't really know Greek well enough for the task. He didn't care. He was keeping his mind active, proving he could still work. And there's something perfect about Hobbes ending his career with Homer. The Iliad is about what happens when political authority breaks down, when Agamemnon and Achilles can't resolve their dispute peacefully. The result is catastrophe, death, suffering on an epic scale. The Odyssey is about a man trying to get home, to restore order to his household, to reclaim his rightful place. Both poems deal with the fundamental Hobbesian themes: power, authority, the fragility of peace. He lived until 1679, 91 years old, an extraordinary age for the 17th century. His body failed gradually, his mind remaining sharp until nearly the end. He died at Hardwicke Hall, the estate of the Cavendish family, who'd supported him his entire adult life. His last words were reportedly about the nature of consciousness, still wrestling with philosophical questions to the final moment. There was no grand funeral. The church wouldn't have permitted it anyway. He was buried quietly in a local church, the grave marked with a simple stone. For a man who'd been one of the most famous intellectuals in Europe, the ending was modest. But endings aren't what matter. What matters is the work left behind. And Leviathan, that dangerous book that everyone had tried to suppress or refute or ignore, refused to die. It kept being read, kept influencing thinkers, kept forcing people to confront uncomfortable questions about power and authority. The 18th century arrived, and with it came new philosophers building on Hobbes's foundation. John Locke read Leviathan and developed his own social contract theory, rejecting Hobbes's absolutism but accepting his basic framework. Jean-Jacques Rousseau did the same, transforming Hobbes's pessimistic view of human nature into something more optimistic while keeping the contractual structure. Even critics who despised Hobbes's conclusions had to engage with his arguments. You couldn't write political philosophy after Leviathan without taking a position on Hobbes. Agree or disagree, but you had to respond. And slowly, certain Hobbesian insights became so widely accepted that people forgot they'd once been controversial. The idea that governments exist to protect citizens, that political authority requires some form of consent, that religious authorities shouldn't dictate to secular powers. These were radical claims in 1651. By 1776, they were practically conventional wisdom, at least among educated people. The American colonists who wrote the Declaration of Independence were working in a Hobbesian tradition, whether they acknowledged it or not. They believed government derived its authority from the consent of the governed. They believed that when government failed to protect people's rights, those people could withdraw consent and establish new institutions. This was social contract theory, the intellectual framework Hobbes had pioneered. They rejected his absolutism, yes, but they accepted his fundamental premise about where political authority comes from. Not from God, not from ancient tradition, not from military might alone. From agreement, from contract, from the collective decision of individuals to create and maintain government. That was Hobbes's revolution. He'd taken politics out of the realm of theology and tradition and placed it in the realm of reason and consent. Everything after had to contend with that shift. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, and suddenly Hobbes looked prophetic. Here was what happened when authority collapsed, when the social contract dissolved. The revolutionaries talked about overthrowing tyranny, about liberty and equality. What they got was the terror. Tens of thousands executed, violence spiraling out of control, chaos that eventually produced Napoleon, another absolute ruler who at least could maintain order. Conservatives pointed to France and said, "See, this is what Hobbes warned about. Break the bonds of authority, and you get bloodshed." The revolutionaries were naive about human nature, naive about what happens when you tear down existing institutions without something stable to replace them. But others drew different lessons. Maybe the problem wasn't that the French had broken their social contract. Maybe the problem was that the old regime had broken it first, that the monarchy had violated its obligations so thoroughly that revolution became inevitable. Hobbes himself had acknowledged that sovereigns who failed to protect their subjects forfeited their authority. The 19th century arrived and Hobbes's reputation underwent another transformation. Victorian England didn't like him much. Too cynical, too materialistic, too dismissive of religion and morality. The Victorians preferred to believe that humans were basically decent, that progress was inevitable, that Christian values could guide political life. But then came the 20th century, and the 20th century was very, very Hobbesian. 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes in Germany, Russia, China, the Holocaust, atomic weapons. Suddenly Hobbes's bleak view of human nature didn't seem quite so ridiculous. His insistence that without strong government humans would revert to violence looked uncomfortably prescient. Political scientists started reading Leviathan again, this time with new appreciation. International relations theorists found Hobbes especially relevant. His description of the state of nature, where there's no common authority and everyone lives in constant fear, that was basically the international system. Nations existed in a Hobbesian state of nature with respect to each other. No world government, no reliable enforcement mechanism, just power and the threat of war. This became known as realism in international relations theory. The idea that nations act in their own interest, that morality doesn't really govern international affairs, that peace depends on balance of power rather than goodwill. It's basically Hobbesian philosophy applied to global politics. The Cold War made Hobbes seem even more relevant. Here were 2 superpowers, each terrified of the other, each building massive nuclear arsenals, precisely because they didn't trust the other side. Mutual fear creating mutual deterrence. It was the logic of Leviathan playing out on a global scale. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, what happened? In many places, chaos. Yugoslavia descended into ethnic warfare. Somalia became a failed state. Rwanda experienced genocide. Remove the strong central authority, Hobbes would have said, and this is what you get. But here's what's interesting. The places that transitioned successfully from communism to democracy Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, they didn't just embrace freedom and hope everything worked out. They built strong institutions first: constitutional courts, independent judiciaries, professional civil services. They created new social contracts, new forms of authority that people could trust. They proved that you could move beyond Hobbesian absolutism, but only by taking seriously his insight about the necessity of effective government. Modern political philosophy still grapples with the tensions Hobbes identified. How do you balance individual liberty with collective security? How much power should government have? What happens when people disagree fundamentally about how society should be organized? Liberals emphasize individual rights and limited government, but even liberals acknowledge you need some government, some enforcement mechanism. Pure libertarianism, the idea that we could just do away with most government functions, has never worked anywhere it's been tried. Because Hobbes was right about one thing: without effective authority, cooperation breaks down. Communitarians emphasize social bonds and shared values, but they still need government to maintain those bonds, to protect communities from internal and external threats. You can't just rely on goodwill and tradition. Socialists want government to do much more, to actively redistribute resources and manage the economy. But they're still working within a Hobbesian framework. They just think the social contract should obligate government to provide economic security, not just physical safety. The debates continue. They'll never stop, because Hobbes identified a permanent tension in political life. We need government, but government is dangerous. We need authority, but authority can be abused. We need to surrender some freedom to gain security, but how much? And who decides? Every generation has to answer these questions again. The specific circumstances change. We're not worried about civil war in 17th century England anymore, but the underlying problems remain. Consider the contemporary debate about surveillance. After 9/11, governments around the world expanded their monitoring capabilities dramatically. They justified this in explicitly Hobbesian terms. The threat is real. People could die. We need these powers to protect you. Critics responded, but who watches the watchers? How do we know these powers won't be abused? This is exactly the problem Hobbes never solved. He wanted absolute authority to maintain security. But absolute authority terrifies us precisely because we know it can turn tyrannical. Or consider pandemic response. When COVID-19 hit, governments imposed lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine requirements. Again, the justification was Hobbesian. There's a deadly threat. Individual freedom has to yield to collective safety. And again, critics pushed back. At what cost? How much control are we willing to cede? When does temporary emergency power become permanent? These are Hobbes' questions, still unanswered after nearly 400 years. The digital age creates new Hobbesian dilemmas. Social media platforms are private companies, but they've become essential infrastructure for public discourse. Should they be regulated like utilities? Should government control what appears on them? Or is that too much power? Hobbes would recognize this problem immediately. It's about authority. Who decides what speech is acceptable? Who enforces those decisions? What happens when people disagree fundamentally about the rules? His answer would likely be, someone has to decide, and whoever decides must have the authority to enforce their decision. Otherwise, you get chaos, endless conflict, the breakdown of communication itself. But we're not satisfied with that answer anymore. We want protections, limits, checks and balances. We want authority that's accountable, government that's constrained. We've learnt from history that absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we're trying to thread a needle Hobbes said couldn't be threaded. We want effective government without tyranny. We want security without surveillance. We want order without oppression. Maybe we can't have it all. Maybe every society has to choose where on the spectrum between anarchy and tyranny it wants to live. Maybe the best we can do is maintain constant vigilance, constantly adjusting the balance as circumstances change. Or maybe, and this would have appalled Hobbes, maybe democracy itself is the answer. Not because people are wise or virtuous, Hobbes was right that they're not, but because democratic systems distribute power, create competition between factions, prevent any single authority from becoming absolute. That was James Madison's insight in Federalist 51. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Set power against power, faction against faction, and maybe you can achieve stability without tyranny. Hobbes wouldn't have liked this solution. He thought divided authority was a recipe for civil war, but the American experiment has now lasted nearly 250 years. Not perfectly, not without serious problems, but it's lasted. The social contract keeps being renegotiated, and usually peacefully. Maybe humans are capable of more than Hobbes gave them credit for. Maybe we can maintain order without absolute rulers. Maybe the social contract can be sustained through ongoing dialogue and compromise rather than fear and force. Or maybe we've just been lucky. Maybe the stability of modern democracies depends on conditions that won't last. Economic prosperity, external threats that unite us, shared cultural values that are now fracturing. There are reasons to worry. Political polarization is increasing in many democracies. Trust in institutions is declining. The social fabric seems to be fraying. What happens when people no longer agree on basic facts, when they can't even have productive conversations with those who think differently? Hobbes would say, "I told you so," without a common authority to determine truth, without shared assumptions about reality itself, the social contract breaks down. You're headed back to the state of nature, to tribalism and conflict. Is he right? Are we seeing the beginning of a Hobbesian collapse? Or are these just normal democratic tensions, the kind of conflicts that get resolved through elections and compromise? Nobody knows. We're living through it in real time. History hasn't rendered its verdict yet, but this much is clear. The questions Hobbes asked in 1651 remain urgently relevant. How do we live together despite our differences? How do we maintain order without tyranny? How do we balance individual freedom with collective security? These aren't abstract philosophical puzzles. They're practical challenges that every society faces, every generation. And Thomas Hobbes, that strange, difficult, controversial thinker from 4 centuries ago, still has something to teach us about them. Not because he got everything right, he didn't. His view of human nature was too dark, his prescription too authoritarian, his dismissal of moral constraints too cavalier. But because he asked the right questions, because he forced us to think clearly about power and authority, because he stripped away comfortable illusions and made us confront hard truths about politics and human nature. Leviathan is still worth reading, still worth grappling with, not to accept its conclusions, but to sharpen our own thinking, to understand the logic of political authority, even if we ultimately reject Hobbes's absolutism. Every political philosophy student encounters Hobbes, usually early, because he's foundational. You can't understand later thinkers without understanding what they're reacting against. Locke makes sense only as a response to Hobbes. Rousseau makes sense only as an attempt to solve problems Hobbes identified. And that's Hobbes's real legacy. Not that he solved political philosophy, he didn't, but that he defined its terrain. He established the questions, developed the vocabulary, created the framework within which subsequent debates occurred. When we talk about social contracts today, we're using Hobbes's language. When we debate the proper scope of government authority, we're engaged with Hobbes's questions. When we worry about the breakdown of civil society, we're channeling Hobbes's fears. He's inescapable. He's part of how we think about politics, whether we know it or not. His ideas have seeped into our collective consciousness, becoming assumptions we don't even recognize as assumptions anymore. That's what it means to be a truly influential thinker. Not that everyone agrees with you, but that everyone has to engage with you. That you change the terms of debate so fundamentally that later thinkers can't avoid your shadow. Hobbes did that. The frightened man who wrote a dangerous book changed how humanity thinks about government and authority. The pessimist who expected the worst from human nature helped create the intellectual foundations for modern political systems. The philosopher who never held political power himself reshaped how power is understood and exercised, not through force or charisma, but through argument, through the careful construction of a logical system that people couldn't ignore even when they desperately wanted to. That's the power of ideas. That's what philosophy can do when it's done with rigor and courage and clarity. One man, one book, one sustained argument, and centuries later, we're still working through the implications. Now Hobbes' great rival enters the picture. John Locke, born 20 years after Hobbes, would write the book that answered Leviathan with a completely different vision of government and human nature. Where Hobbes saw humans as naturally violent and selfish, Locke saw them as reasonable beings capable of cooperation. Where Hobbes demanded absolute authority, Locke insisted on limited government. Where Hobbes made the sovereign untouchable, Locke gave the people the right to overthrow tyrants. The two treatises of government, published in 1689, became the philosophical foundation for liberal democracy. It's the book that shaped the American Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the entire framework of rights-based government that we now take for granted. But here's what most people don't know about that book. Locke lied about it. He published it anonymously, claimed it was written to justify the glorious revolution of 1688, and went to his grave maintaining that fiction. In reality, he'd been working on it for years, developing ideas that were far more radical than he dared to admit publicly. Locke was careful where Hobbes was reckless. He was strategic where Hobbes was provocative. And that difference in temperament explains why Locke's ideas succeeded in reshaping governments, while Hobbes's remained controversial. Locke's state of nature looks completely different from Hobbes's war of all against all. Yes, there's no government, no police, no courts, but Locke argues that even without these institutions, human beings possess natural rights. Life, liberty, and property are yours by virtue of being human, not because any government grants them to you. This is huge. Hobbes said, rights come from the sovereign. You have only what Leviathan permits. Locke says rights precede government. They're built into the natural order, discoverable through reason, and no political authority can legitimately take them away. In the state of nature, according to Locke, people can actually get along reasonably well. They can make agreements, respect each other's property, and live in relative peace. The problem isn't that humans are monsters. The problem is inconvenience. When disputes arise, there's no neutral judge to settle them. When someone violates your rights, there's no reliable mechanism for punishment or restitution. So people form governments not out of terror, but out of practicality. They consent to create political authority for specific, limited purposes, to establish impartial courts, to enforce property rights, to provide collective security. The social contract isn't an act of desperate surrender. It's a rational arrangement that makes life better while preserving fundamental freedoms. And here's the crucial twist. The government serves the people, not the other way around. Political authority is conditional. If the government violates the trust placed in it, if it becomes tyrannical or fails to protect rights, then the people have the right to dissolve it and start over. This is revolutionary. Hobbes had said that once you establish the sovereign, you're stuck with it forever, no matter how badly it behaves. Locke says no, governments can be fired. The ultimate power remains with the people. The implications were immediately obvious to anyone paying attention. This was a recipe for rebellion, for challenging kings, for justifying revolution, which is exactly why Locke published anonymously and carefully obscured when he'd actually written it. His timing was perfect. The book appeared just after James II had been overthrown, and William and Mary installed on the English throne. Locke could present his treatise as a philosophical defence of what had just happened, making it seem like respectable justification rather than dangerous incitement. But the work had deeper roots. Locke had been involved with Whig opposition politics for years, had fled to Holland when his patron fell from power, had watched friends executed for plotting against the crown. The two treatises emerged from real political struggle, not abstract theorising. The first treatise, which almost nobody reads today, was a detailed demolition of Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, a book defending absolute monarchy through the argument that kings inherit their authority from Adam, the first father. Locke systematically shredded this theory, showing that even if you accept the biblical premise, the argument doesn't work. Which family line descends from Adam? How would we verify it? Why would ancient patriarchal authority transfer to modern kings? It's a thorough job, but the real action is in the second treatise, where Locke builds his positive theory. Property plays a central role. Locke argues that you own your own body, and therefore you own your labour. When you mix your labour with natural resources, when you clear a field, plant crops, build a fence, you make that land your property. It's yours not because a king granted it, but because you created value through your own effort. This labour theory of property had massive implications for emerging capitalism. It justified private ownership, wealth accumulation, and market economies in terms that didn't depend on aristocratic privilege or royal favour. A commoner who worked hard had as legitimate a claim to property as any nobleman. But Locke wasn't an absolutist about property rights. He included important limitations. You can claim only as much as you can actually use. Taking more while others starve violates natural law. There must be enough and as good left for others, and you can't let things spoil through waste. These provisos get ignored by libertarians who want to claim Locke as one of their own. They focus on the property rights, while skipping over the moral constraints Locke built into the system. The separation of powers doctrine that became fundamental to American constitutionalism comes directly from Locke. He argued that legislative and executive functions should be separated, that no single person or body should make the laws and also enforce them. The concentration of power leads inevitably to tyranny. He went further. The legislative power, while supreme, is itself limited. There are things no legislature can legitimately do, no matter how many representatives vote for it. It cannot violate natural rights. It cannot rule by arbitrary decrees rather than established laws. It cannot take property without consent, which is why taxation requires representative government. This creates a hierarchy. Natural law sits above political authority. Human rights constrain what governments can do. And if government violates these fundamental limits, resistance becomes not just permissible, but obligatory. Locke was careful to say that rebellion should be rare, that people tolerate a great deal before rising up. He wasn't advocating constant revolution, but he was establishing that tyranny breaks the social contract, and when the contract is broken, the people return to their natural liberty. Reading Locke after Hobbes is like stepping from a dungeon into daylight. Where Hobbes is claustrophobic and paranoid, Locke is spacious and optimistic. Where Hobbes sees humans as fundamentally dangerous, Locke sees them as capable of reason and cooperation. Where Hobbes builds walls, Locke opens doors. But Locke had his blind spots too. His treatment of property conveniently ignored how European colonizers were using exactly these arguments to justify seizing Native American lands. He claimed that indigenous peoples weren't really using the land productively, so colonists could legitimately take it. This self-serving interpretation allowed him to square his theory with the colonial projects he financially supported. He also invested in the slave trade. The philosopher who wrote so eloquently about natural liberty and the impossibility of enslaving oneself held shares in slave trading companies. He helped write the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which granted slaveholders absolute power over their enslaved people. This tension runs through Locke's work. He's genuinely committed to human freedom and equality, but only for some humans. The full universalism of his principles gets restricted by the prejudices of his time and place. Later thinkers would have to extend Locke's logic beyond the boundaries he himself accepted. The influence of the two treatises on American founders is undeniable. When Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he was channeling pure Locke. The Declaration of Independence is essentially a Lockean document, arguing that George III had violated the social contract, and therefore the colonies had the right to dissolve their political connection with Britain. The Constitution's system of checks and balances, its separation of powers, its Bill of Rights protecting individual liberties against government encroachment, all of this reflects Lockean principles. The founders weren't slavishly following Locke's blueprint, but they were working firmly within his framework. And it wasn't just America. Revolutionary movements across Europe and Latin America invoked Lockean ideas about consent, natural rights, and the right to overthrow tyranny. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen echoes Locke. So do the constitutions of dozens of countries that established representative governments in the centuries after his death. Locke succeeded where Hobbes failed because he offered a vision of political authority that people actually wanted to live under. Hobbes's Leviathan might be logically coherent, but it's also terrifying. Who wants to live in a state where the sovereign has absolute power and you have no recourse against tyranny? Locke's system, by contrast, promises security without sacrificing freedom. It protects property while acknowledging moral limits. It establishes strong government while maintaining popular sovereignty. It's a system designed for humans as they actually are, neither angels nor demons, but rational creatures capable of both cooperation and conflict. The debate between Hobbes and Locke isn't settled. We're still arguing about it. How much authority should government have? Where do we draw the line between security and liberty? When does the social contract break down? What rights are truly fundamental? Every time there's a political crisis, these questions resurface. After 9/11, the Patriot Act debate was essentially a Hobbes-Locke debate. How much freedom should we sacrifice for security? Can the government be trusted with expanded surveillance powers? Are there some liberties that can't be traded away no matter what the threat? During the pandemic, the same tensions emerged. Government lockdowns to protect public health versus individual freedom to move and associate. Trust in authority versus skepticism of power. The trade-offs between collective welfare and personal liberty. These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical dilemmas that force us to choose between competing values, neither of which we want to completely abandon. Locke gives us a framework for thinking through these choices. Not a formula that automatically generates right answers, but a set of principles for evaluating government actions. Does this policy violate fundamental rights? Is there a legitimate public purpose? Are the restrictions proportionate to the threat? Can the measures be challenged and reviewed? This is what political philosophy at its best provides. Not dogma, but tools for clear thinking about power and freedom. Hobbes and Locke together define the terrain of modern political thought. They established the questions, developed the vocabulary, created the conceptual frameworks that subsequent thinkers either accepted or rebelled against. You can't understand Rousseau without understanding how he tried to synthesize Hobbesian pessimism with Lockean freedom. You can't understand the American founding without seeing how it balanced Hobbesian concerns about faction and disorder with Lockean commitments to rights and consent. Even contemporary debates about the scope of government, the nature of rights, and the limits of political authority are still operating within categories these two thinkers established. We've refined their arguments, challenged their assumptions, extended their logic in new directions, but we're still on the terrain they mapped out. That's the mark of genuinely foundational thinking. Not that it's perfect or complete, but that it establishes the framework within which future thinking occurs. And now we need to meet the third great contract theorist, the one who took Hobbes's dark view of civilization and Locke's commitment to freedom and somehow forged them into something entirely new. The one who said that humanity had lost something precious in leaving the state of nature, and that the social contract needed to be completely reimagined. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was about to make everything more complicated, more passionate, and more revolutionary than either of his predecessors could have imagined. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in Geneva in 1712, and almost immediately tragedy marked him. His mother died 9 days after his birth. His father, a watchmaker, was unstable and eventually abandoned him. Rousseau would spend his life searching for the belonging he never found in childhood, and that search would reshape political philosophy. He was nothing like Hobbes or Locke. They were scholars, systematic thinkers, men who built careful arguments brick by brick. Rousseau was wild, emotional, brilliant, and frequently impossible. He quarrelled with everyone who tried to help him. He abandoned his own children to orphanages. He wrote confessions so raw and honest they scandalized Europe. He was paranoid, convinced that conspiracies surrounded him, and he wrote with a passion that made even his most abstract ideas feel urgently personal. Where Hobbes saw humanity's natural state as violent chaos and Locke saw it as reasonably peaceful, if somewhat inconvenient, Rousseau had a radically different vision. The state of nature wasn't hell, it was paradise lost. His masterwork, The Social Contract, published in 1762, opens with one of the most famous lines in political philosophy: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." This isn't metaphor. Rousseau meant it literally. Human beings, in their natural state, were free, genuinely free in ways we can barely imagine. And then something happened. We created civilization, and civilization destroyed us. But here's where Rousseau gets interesting, where he breaks from both his predecessors and charts entirely new territory. He doesn't want to go back to the state of nature. That's impossible. We can't unlearn agriculture, abandon cities, forget language. The past is lost. What we need instead is a new kind of social contract, one that can restore freedom within civilization itself. This is the problem Rousseau sets himself: how to create legitimate political authority that doesn't enslave us, how to have society without chains. His answer revolves around a concept that would become central to modern politics, but remains deeply confusing: the general will. The general will isn't the same as the will of the majority. It's not just counting votes and seeing which side has more. The general will is what the community would want if everyone set aside their private interests and thought only about the common good. It's the collective rationality of a people, their shared understanding of what's best for everyone. When a legitimate government acts, it doesn't impose its will on the people, it expresses the general will. The people are both sovereign and subject, both rulers and ruled. They obey only themselves, collectively organised. This is how Rousseau thinks we can be free while living under law. We're not submitting to someone else's authority. We're submitting to our own collective will. You can already see the problem. Who determines what the general will actually is? If I vote against a law and it passes anyway, am I being forced to obey something that isn't my will? Rousseau's answer is yes, but you're being forced to be free. The majority didn't just outvote you. They revealed what you should have wanted if you'd been thinking clearly about the common good rather than your private interest. This is simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. Brilliant because it solves the fundamental problem of political obligation without appealing to divine right or might makes right. We should obey the law because the law is our own creation, the expression of our collective freedom. Terrifying because it can justify forcing people to conform for their own good, crushing individual liberty in the name of collective freedom. The French Revolution would embrace Rousseau with catastrophic consequences. Robespierre and the Jacobins believed they were implementing the general will when they sent thousands to the guillotine. The terror was justified as forcing France to be free, eliminating enemies of the people who threatened the collective good. This is what happens when you combine Rousseau's ideas with political fanaticism and revolutionary violence. But that doesn't mean Rousseau was wrong, just dangerous. His diagnosis of what's wrong with modern society remains penetrating. We're alienated from ourselves, from each other, from nature. We perform roles rather than living authentically. We compete constantly, measuring ourselves against others, never satisfied, never whole. Civilization has made us sophisticated, but also miserable. Rousseau traced this corruption back to a single moment, a moment that destroyed natural human goodness. Someone enclosed a piece of land, declared, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him. That was the birth of property, and with it came inequality, conflict, and all the evils of civilization. This is radically different from Locke, who thought property was natural and just. For Rousseau, property is the original sin, the source of everything wrong with human society. It creates inequality. Some people accumulate more than others. The rich need protection for their wealth, so they trick the poor into creating a state that will enforce property rights. The poor agree, thinking they're getting security and law. What they actually get is permanent subordination, their chains legalized and legitimized. The state in Rousseau's analysis isn't a neutral arbiter protecting everyone's rights. It's a tool of the wealthy to maintain their advantages. The social contract as it actually exists is a fraud, a clever scheme to make exploitation seem natural and just. So what would a legitimate social contract look like? One that doesn't just protect property and maintain inequality, but actually serves the common good? Rousseau's vision is demanding. First, the state must be small enough that everyone can participate directly. Representative democracy isn't good enough. When you elect representatives, you're sovereign only on election day. The rest of the time, you're a subject. True freedom requires direct participation in lawmaking. The general will can only emerge when citizens gather together to deliberate and decide. Second, there can't be massive inequality. If some citizens are extremely wealthy and others desperately poor, they don't share a common interest. The rich will use their resources to corrupt the political process. The poor will be too dependent to participate as equals. A legitimate republic requires rough economic equality. Third, citizens need to prioritize the common good over private interest. This isn't natural. It requires civic education, carefully designed institutions, and what Rousseau calls civil religion. Not traditional religion with its supernatural claims, but a set of shared values that bind citizens together and make them willing to sacrifice for the community. This is an extraordinarily demanding vision of political life. It requires small states, direct democracy, economic equality, and constant civic virtue. No wonder it's rarely been achieved, but Rousseau would say that's exactly the point. Most governments aren't legitimate. Most social contracts are frauds. We've accepted change as natural when they're actually choices we can reject. The tension in Rousseau's thought is obvious. He wants freedom but demands conformity. He celebrates individuality but requires citizens to subordinate themselves to the general will. He hates inequality but grants the state enormous power to enforce equality. He seems to want both anarchic liberty and totalitarian unity. His critics pounce on these contradictions. Isaiah Berlin famously argued that Rousseau's positive liberty, the freedom to participate in collective self-government, inevitably crushes negative liberty, the freedom to be left alone. Forcing people to be free is still forcing them. The general will becomes whatever the regime says it is, and dissenters become enemies of the people. But Rousseau's defenders point out that he's describing an ideal, not a practical program. He's showing us what legitimate authority would look like if we could achieve it, not promising that we can. And his critique of existing society remains powerful, even if his alternative is problematic. Maybe he's right that we're enslaved by property, corrupted by inequality, alienated from our true nature. Maybe recognizing that is valuable, even if his solution is flawed. What's undeniable is Rousseau's influence. The French Revolution, the Romantic movement, modern democracy, socialist thought, communitarian philosophy, all flow from his work. The idea that government should serve the common good rather than protecting property, the belief that political legitimacy requires popular participation, the sense that something precious was lost in modernity, the conviction that freedom means more than being left alone. These are Rousseauian ideas. Even critics who reject his conclusions engage with his questions. What makes government legitimate? What do we owe to the community versus ourselves? Can individual freedom coexist with collective self-government? Is equality necessary for liberty? These debates define modern politics, and Rousseau put them on the table. The contrast with Hobbes and Locke is striking. Hobbes wanted absolute sovereignty to prevent chaos. Locke wanted limited government to protect rights. Rousseau wanted something neither envisioned, a politics that transforms us, that makes us better than we naturally are, that creates genuine freedom through collective self-governance. All three thinkers agree we need a social contract. We can't live in the state of nature. But they disagree profoundly about what that contract should protect and what it requires of us. For Hobbes, it's security. Give the sovereign absolute power and get peace in return. For Locke, it's rights. Government exists to protect life, liberty, and property, with strict limits on its authority. For Rousseau, it's freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to participate in collective self-determination, to be both ruler and ruled. These aren't just theoretical positions, they're competing visions of what political life should be. And we're still choosing between them, still trying to balance security against liberty, individual rights against common good, representative government against direct participation. The social contract tradition gives us a framework for these debates, not answers, but better questions. What would rational people agree to? What rights can't be traded away? What does legitimate authority require? When can we resist? These questions structure how we think about politics, even when we've never read a word of political philosophy. And there's something deeper here, something about the very act of asking these questions. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau all rejected the idea that political authority is natural or God-given. Kings don't rule by divine right. The powerful don't deserve power simply because they have it. Government needs justification, and that justification has to appeal to reason and benefit the governed. This is revolutionary. It means every government can be questioned, every law can be challenged, every authority can be asked to explain itself. There's no sacred foundation that can't be examined. Political philosophy becomes critical philosophy, and criticism becomes a civic duty. The social contract theorists gave us permission to think clearly about power. They insisted that political arrangements are human creations, not natural facts. If we made them, we can remake them. If they don't serve us, we can change them. Authority that can't justify itself is just force, and force alone creates no obligation. This is why these thinkers matter. Not because they provided final answers, but because they established that questioning authority is legitimate, that power requires justification, that government exists to serve the governed. These ideas seem obvious now. They weren't obvious in the 17th and 18th centuries, and they're still contested in much of the world today. Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau wrote the grammar of modern political thought. We still speak their language, still argue within the framework they established. Every debate about the scope of government, the nature of rights, the basis of political obligation, the balance between security and freedom happens in conceptual space they mapped out. And now we need to see where these ideas led, how they escaped the library and entered the streets. Because social contract theory didn't stay theoretical. It became revolutionary, providing the intellectual foundation for two of the most important political transformations in modern history. The American Revolution would turn Locke's abstractions into concrete institutions. The French Revolution would try to implement Rousseau's demanding vision of collective freedom. Both would claim to be fulfilling the social contract, creating government by consent, establishing legitimate political authority. Both would struggle with contradictions between theory and practice, between philosophical ideals and political reality. The American colonists didn't set out to create a revolution. They wanted their rights as Englishmen respected, the traditional liberties they believed they were owed. But when Parliament kept insisting it could tax them without representation, when the king sent troops to occupy their cities, when every petition was ignored, Locke's theory stopped being abstract philosophy and became urgent necessity. The Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, reads like Locke's second treatise, translated into revolutionary proclamation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is social contract theory as political manifesto. Government exists to protect natural rights. Its authority comes from consent. And the next line makes the revolutionary implication explicit. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Locke had given them permission to resist. The Declaration listed their grievances, the ways King George had violated the social contract. He had refused to pass necessary laws. He had dissolved legislative assemblies. He had imposed taxes without consent. He had maintained standing armies in peacetime. He had obstructed justice and made judges dependent on his will. Each complaint documented a breach of the contract between ruler and ruled. The colonists weren't rebelling against legitimate authority. They were dissolving a relationship that the king himself had broken. The logic is impeccable if you accept Locke's premises. Government without consent is tyranny. Tyranny dissolves political obligation. Therefore, resistance is justified. But declaring independence and actually creating legitimate government are different problems. The colonists won their war, but then they had to figure out what comes next. How do you turn social contract theory into actual institutions? The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, created a weak central government that could barely function. Too much Locke, perhaps, too worried about tyranny to grant sufficient power. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 tried again. This time, they built something more robust, a federal system with separation of powers, checks and balances, enumerated rights. They weren't starting from scratch in a state of nature, but they were doing something close, creating new political structures through deliberation and agreement. James Madison, the primary architect of the Constitution, understood the social contract tradition deeply. He knew that simply appealing to natural rights wasn't enough. You needed institutional design, mechanisms to prevent any faction from dominating, structures that would channel self-interest toward public good. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition, he wrote. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Since they're not, you need systems that work with human nature as it is. The American experiment became a test case. Can you actually create legitimate government through reason and consent? Can social contract theory work in practice? The answer was complicated. The Constitution established a framework that's lasted over 2 centuries, longer than most governments in history. But it also contained a massive contradiction that Locke's theory couldn't resolve. All men are created equal, the Declaration said. Meanwhile, 1/5 of the American population was enslaved. The men writing about natural rights owned other human beings. Some of them recognized the hypocrisy. Jefferson called slavery a moral depravity and predicted it would eventually destroy the Union. But he kept owning slaves. Madison kept owning slaves. The Constitution itself protected slavery without naming it, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. This isn't just historical irony, it's a fundamental problem with contract theory. If political legitimacy comes from consent, what about people who were never asked? What about those explicitly excluded from the social contract? The theory says everyone has natural rights, but the practice created a republic for white men with property. Women couldn't vote. Native Americans weren't citizens. Enslaved people had no rights at all. The social contract applied only to those already recognized as full members of political society. It would take centuries of struggle, civil war, constitutional amendments, and mass movements to expand that circle. Across the Atlantic, another revolution was brewing. France in 1789 faced a fiscal crisis, a rigid class system, and a king who ruled by divine right. When the Estates General met for the first time in over a century, representatives of the Third Estate, the common people, declared themselves the National Assembly and claimed sovereignty. The French Revolution made the American Revolution look cautious. Where Americans had carefully constructed institutions, the French attempted radical transformation. They wanted to remake society from the ground up, to implement Rousseau's vision of collective freedom. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted in August 1789, proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. That sovereignty resides in the nation. That law is the expression of the general will. This is Rousseau's language. Not individual rights protected from government, but collective sovereignty expressed through law. Liberty isn't freedom from interference. It's participation in making the laws that bind you. The revolution abolished feudalism, seized church property, executed the king, and attempted to create an entirely new political order based on reason and virtue. But Rousseau's theory contained a dangerous ambiguity. What exactly is the general will? How do you know when you found it? The revolutionaries claimed to embody it, to speak for the people as a whole, but different factions had different ideas about what the people truly willed. The Girondins wanted a republic with protections for property and commerce. The Jacobins wanted radical equality and were willing to use violence to achieve it. Maximilien Robespierre, the most influential Jacobin leader, believed he understood the general will perfectly. It demanded virtue, demanded sacrifice, demanded the elimination of anyone who threatened the Republic. What followed was the Reign of Terror, where thousands were executed as enemies of the people. Robespierre sent aristocrats to the guillotine, then moderate revolutionaries, then rival radicals, then finally went to the guillotine himself. The revolution devoured its children. It began with proclamations of universal rights and ended with mass executions. It promised freedom and delivered dictatorship. Napoleon eventually seized power, crowning himself emperor and conquering most of Europe before his final defeat. The attempt to implement Rousseau's demanding vision of freedom had led to tyranny. Does this mean social contract theory was wrong? That attempting to create legitimate government through reason and consent is doomed? Not necessarily, but it reveals deep tensions in the tradition. Hobbes was right that security requires authority. Locke was right that authority requires limits. Rousseau was right that legitimacy requires participation. But combining these insights is harder than any of them imagined. The American and French revolutions showed both the power and the problems of social contract thinking. Power because these ideas motivated people to overthrow governments that couldn't justify themselves, to demand rights and representation, to insist that political arrangements serve the governed. Problems because translating theory into practice revealed contradictions the philosophers had glossed over. What counts as consent? Locke said people consent to government by choosing to remain in society, but that's not much of a choice for most people. Where exactly are they supposed to go? How can children consent to the government they're born under? Hobbes said the social contract happens once, when people leave the state of nature. But no actual government was created that way. Every real government emerged from history, conquest, tradition, gradual evolution. The pristine moment of rational agreement is a useful fiction, not a historical event. Rousseau said we need to identify the general will, but what mechanism reliably does that? Voting? That reveals preferences, not the common good. Deliberation? That's shaped by who gets to speak and who gets heard. Representation? That creates a gap between the people and their representatives. These aren't just theoretical puzzles, they're practical problems that every democracy faces. How do you know when government acts legitimately? How do you balance individual rights against collective decisions? What do you do when majority rule threatens minorities? When does protest become justified resistance? When does resistance become mere rebellion? Social contract theory doesn't answer these questions definitively. What it does is establish the terms of debate. It insists that political authority needs justification, that government exists to serve the governed, that power without legitimacy is just force. These ideas have become so fundamental to modern political thinking that we barely notice them. But they weren't obvious before Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau made them so. The revolutions they inspired didn't create perfect governments. They created flawed, struggling, often failing attempts to implement philosophical ideals in messy reality. But those attempts changed the world. They established that governments could be questioned, that authority needed to justify itself, that ordinary people had rights that even kings must respect. Every modern democracy inherits this legacy. When we vote, we're exercising popular sovereignty. When we appeal to constitutional rights, we're invoking limits on government power. When we debate the scope of state authority, we're working through tensions between security and liberty that Hobbes and Locke identified. When we argue about what the public good requires, we're grappling with Rousseau's question about the general will. Political philosophy didn't end with the social contract tradition. Later thinkers would criticize these ideas, develop alternatives, point out blind spots and contradictions. But they couldn't escape the framework these three thinkers established. The questions they raised remain our questions. And perhaps that's the real achievement, not providing final answers, but changing what counts as a legitimate question. Before social contract theory, you might ask, who should rule? The king, the nobles, the priests? After social contract theory, you ask, why should anyone rule at all? What justifies political authority? How do we create legitimate government? These are better questions. They don't guarantee good government, but they make bad government harder to sustain. They don't solve all political problems, but they give us tools for thinking clearly about power. And they establish something crucial, that ordinary people, using their own reason, can evaluate political arrangements and demand better. Hobbes wrote to prevent civil war. Locke wrote to justify revolution. Rousseau wrote to reimagine freedom. All three believed that philosophy could illuminate politics, that clear thinking about fundamental principles could help us create better societies. They were partly right. Ideas alone don't change the world, but they change how we see the world, and that changes what we're willing to accept. The social contract is a fiction. No one actually signed it. The state of nature never existed. The general will remains elusive. But these fictions help us think more clearly about real problems. They give us concepts for criticizing injustice, demanding rights, establishing legitimacy. They translate vague dissatisfaction into precise claims about what government owes us and what we owe each other. 3 centuries after Hobbes published Leviathan, we're still working out the implications, still balancing security against liberty, individual rights against common good, the need for authority against the demand for consent. Still trying to create political arrangements that protect us from each other without crushing us beneath their weight. The social contract tradition gave us the vocabulary for these efforts. Not a blueprint, but a language. Not final answers, but better questions. And sometimes, better questions are exactly what we need. Thomas Hobbes died on December 4th, 1679, at Hardwicke Hall. He was 91 years old, an extraordinary age for any era, let alone the 17th century. His mind had remained sharp almost to the end, still engaging with philosophical questions, still writing, still arguing. His last words were supposedly about the nature of consciousness, about what happens when the light goes out. Then the light went out. He was buried at the parish church of Alt Hucknall in Derbyshire, far from the centres of power where his ideas had caused such turmoil. The stone marking his grave was simple, understated, nothing like the massive intellectual monument he'd built with his pen. The inscription noted his age and his works, but said little about the revolution in thinking he'd accomplished. There was no grand funeral procession. The church that had condemned him as a heretic wasn't about to celebrate his passing. The universities where his books had been banned didn't send delegations. He died as he'd lived in his later years, surrounded by a small circle of friends and the ever-present ghosts of controversies that would outlive him by centuries. But here's what's remarkable. The man who was so controversial, so dangerous, so thoroughly attacked during his lifetime, his ideas didn't die with him. They metastasized. They spread through European thought like an infection that no amount of censorship could contain. His critics kept the debate alive by refuting him, and every refutation required engaging with his arguments, spreading them further. John Locke wrote his 2 treatises partly to answer Hobbes, but he couldn't escape Hobbes's framework. The social contract, the state of nature, the question of political legitimacy, these were Hobbes's contributions, and Locke was working within categories Hobbes had established even while rejecting his conclusions. Rousseau attacked Hobbes's view of human nature, but built his entire system around questions Hobbes had made central. What is the basis of political authority? How do we escape the state of nature? What does legitimate government require? Every political philosopher who came after had to position themselves relative to Hobbes. You could agree or disagree, but you couldn't ignore him. He'd changed the terrain permanently. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment, and suddenly Hobbes looked prophetic. His materialism, his emphasis on reason over tradition, his insistence on questioning authority, these aligned perfectly with the new intellectual currents. Voltaire admired him. Diderot and the encyclopedists saw him as a forerunner of their project to catalogue and systematize knowledge. The American and French revolutions both emerged from debates Hobbes had started. Not because anyone was following his prescriptions, he'd advocated absolute monarchy after all, but because he'd established that political arrangements needed rational justification. Kings didn't rule by divine right. They ruled because, well, why exactly? Hobbes had forced everyone to ask that question, and once asked, it couldn't be unanswered. The 19th century brought new challenges. Democracy was spreading, and Hobbes's authoritarianism seemed increasingly outdated. But his core insight about the state of nature, about what humans are like without government, kept proving relevant. Every failed state, every civil war, Every collapse into chaos seemed to vindicate his darkest predictions. The 20th century was perhaps Hobbes's century. 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes, the Holocaust, nuclear weapons. Suddenly his bleak view of human nature didn't seem quite so exaggerated. International relations theorists rediscovered him, recognizing that his description of the state of nature perfectly captured how nations relate to each other. No world government, no reliable enforcement of agreements, just power and the constant threat of violence. Realism in international relations is basically Hobbesian philosophy applied globally. Nations act in their own interest. Morality doesn't govern international affairs. Peace depends on balance of power, on mutual fear, on the recognition that war would be costly enough to deter aggression. This is Leviathan playing out on a planetary scale. The Cold War made perfect sense through Hobbesian lenses. 2 superpowers, neither trusting the other, both building massive nuclear arsenals precisely because they feared what the other might do. Mutual, assured destruction was pure Hobbes, peace through terror, stability through the threat of annihilation. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, what happened in places where strong central authority vanished? Yugoslavia descended into ethnic warfare. Somalia became a failed state. Rwanda experienced genocide. Remove the Leviathan, Hobbes would have said, and this is what you get. But the 21st century brought new complications. Hobbes had assumed that the main threat was other humans, that government existed primarily to protect citizens from each other. What about threats that don't respect borders? Climate change, pandemics, terrorism, cyber attacks? These require international cooperation, something Hobbes's framework struggles to accommodate. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed both the strength and weakness of Hobbesian thinking. Yes, we needed authority to coordinate response, to enforce lockdowns, to distribute vaccines. But which authority? National governments acted independently, often competitively. The international state of nature Hobbes described prevented the kind of global cooperation the crisis demanded. And then there's technology. Hobbes couldn't have imagined a world where surveillance is ubiquitous, where governments can track citizens' movements through their phones, where algorithms can predict behavior and manipulate choice. His Leviathan was powerful, but it was still limited by the technology of the 17th century. Modern Leviathans have capabilities Hobbes never dreamed of. They can monitor communications, analyze data, identify dissent before it becomes dangerous. China's social credit system is Hobbesian logic implemented through 21st century technology. Behavior modification through constant observation and control. This raises questions Hobbes didn't fully address. He wanted absolute sovereignty to prevent civil war. But what prevents the sovereign from becoming tyrannical? Hobbes's answer was essentially nothing, and that's the price of security. Most people find that answer insufficient now. We've learned from history that absolute power corrupts absolutely, that governments without checks become monstrous, that authority without accountability is dangerous no matter how necessary it might seem. Hobbes was right about the need for government. He was wrong about how much power government should have. Yet his fundamental insight remains. We need political authority. We can't live in the state of nature. Pure libertarianism, the fantasy of society without government, has never worked anywhere it's been attempted. Because Hobbes understood something essential about human nature. We're not naturally cooperative enough to sustain complex societies without some enforcement mechanism. The question isn't whether we need government, it's what kind of government, with what powers, subject to what constraints. And that's a Hobbesian question, even if we reject his authoritarian answer. Contemporary political philosophy is still wrestling with tensions Hobbes identified. How do we balance security and liberty? How much power should we grant government to protect us? What happens when people disagree fundamentally about how society should be organised? Can we maintain order without crushing freedom? These aren't abstract puzzles, they're urgent practical problems. After 9/11, the debate about the Patriot Act was essentially a debate about Hobbes. How much surveillance should we accept for security? Can we trust government with expanded powers? Are there some liberties that can't be traded away, no matter the threat? During the pandemic, the same tensions emerged. Government lockdowns versus individual freedom. Mandatory vaccines versus bodily autonomy. Trust in authority versus skepticism of power. The trade-offs between collective welfare and personal liberty. Hobbes would have had clear answers. Give government the power it needs to address the crisis. Individual freedom matters less than collective security. Trust the sovereign to act in everyone's interest, but we've learned to be more suspicious, more demanding of justification, more insistent on limits. And this is perhaps where we've moved beyond Hobbes, while remaining in his debt. He taught us to think clearly about political authority, to understand the logic of sovereignty, to recognise the genuine problem that government solves. But he didn't convince us that absolute power is the only solution. Maybe James Madison was right, that ambition must be made to counteract ambition, that you can achieve stability through competing powers rather than concentrated authority. Maybe democracy itself, despite all its flaws and failures, offers a better answer than Hobbes imagined. Or maybe we're fooling ourselves. Maybe the stability of modern democracies depends on conditions that won't last. Economic prosperity, external threats that unite us, shared values that are now fracturing. What happens when those conditions disappear? What happens when polarization becomes so extreme that we can't even agree on basic facts? There are reasons to worry. Trust in institutions is declining. Political violence is increasing. The social fabric seems to be fraying. Hobbes spent his life warning about what happens when the bonds of civil society weaken, when people stop believing in shared rules, when every disagreement becomes existential. Are we heading back towards something like the state of nature? Not the literal state of nature. We're not going to abandon cities and revert to hunting and gathering, but a political state of nature where there's no shared authority, no common framework for resolving disputes, no way to maintain order except through force. Hobbes would say we're at risk, that the complacency of prosperity has made us forget how fragile civilization is, how much work it takes to maintain peace, how quickly order can collapse into chaos. And he might be right, but he might also be wrong. Humans have proven more capable of cooperation than he gave them credit for. We've built institutions that constrain power while maintaining order. We've created systems that allow peaceful transfer of authority, that protect rights while providing security, that balance individual freedom with collective welfare. These systems aren't perfect. They fail regularly, but they've lasted longer and worked better than Hobbes thought possible. And they've done so not by following his prescription for absolute sovereignty, but by rejecting it while keeping his insights about the necessity of political authority. That's the strange legacy of Thomas Hobbes. He was wrong about the solution, but right about the problem. He convinced us that government needs rational justification, that political authority can't rest on tradition or divine right alone, that we need to think clearly about power and legitimacy. But he didn't convince us that absolute monarchy is the answer. Instead, he gave us the tools to develop better answers, by forcing us to confront the state of nature, by making us imagine what life would be like without government. He helped us understand why we need government and what we should demand from it. By arguing for absolute sovereignty, he provoked responses from Locke and Rousseau, and countless others who developed alternative visions of legitimate authority. His influence is everywhere, even when invisible. When we debate the proper scope of government, we're engaged with Hobbesian questions. When we worry about political instability, we're channeling Hobbesian fears. When we demand that authority justify itself, we're applying standards Hobbes helped establish, even as we reject his specific conclusions. The frightened boy born as the Spanish Armada approached, who spent his life thinking about security and order and the fragility of peace, changed how humanity thinks about politics. Not by providing answers everyone accepted, but by asking questions everyone had to engage with. Not by building a system that lasted, but by demolishing assumptions that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Leviathan is still read, still studied, still argued about nearly 4 centuries after publication. Not because it's pleasant or comforting or easy to agree with, because it's honest, rigorous, and impossible to dismiss, because it forces us to think about political authority without sentimentality, to recognize genuine problems that easy answers won't solve, to confront hard truths about human nature and political necessity. Thomas Hobbes died in a borrowed room, but the ideas he wrestled with his entire life remain vitally alive. Every time authority breaks down, every time civil order threatens to collapse, every time we face the question of how to live together despite our differences, Hobbes is there, warning us about the abyss, reminding us what we have to lose. He never solved the problem completely, neither has anyone else, but he taught us to see it clearly, and sometimes clarity is the most valuable thing philosophy can provide. The state of nature he described was always partly metaphor, partly thought experiment, partly warning. We've never lived there, and hopefully never will. But knowing it's possible, understanding what we're avoiding, recognizing how much we depend on political order, that knowledge, uncomfortable as it is, might be exactly what we need to maintain the civilization that Hobbes spent his life trying to protect.